For several centuries, only those people who would graduate from religious seminaries would be considered scholars in the Western world, and they would dominate the intellectual landscape of the Western world and Europe. And they would not allow scientists to come up with their scientific claims, and they vehemently opposed science. In fact, they extended very harsh treatment to some of the famous scientists like Galileo, Copernicus, and Kepler, and they would not tolerate anything that might challenge their religious authority. They would also subject patients of epilepsy and leprosy to a very harsh treatment, and it was perhaps because of this that there was witch hunt in Spain, which is called Inquisition. And during that time, some beautiful women and maybe old women would be subjected to torture, and it was widely believed that evil spirit might have penetrated into the patient suffering from epilepsy. Similarly, a number of women would be considered a magician or witch, and they would be burnt alive. But then, of course, there was the movement of Renaissance in Europe that talked about to revive the Greek thoughts, and especially the pre-Socratic era of Greek thought, where they talked about science and scientific inventions, and where they talked about materialism. The same situation is being faced by the Muslim world today, and it is widely believed that those who graduate from religious seminaries studying Dars-e-Nizami, they are real scholars. But in fact, there are other people who believe that the real religious scholars were the scientists in the Islamic world who happened to be there between 9th century and 9th and 14th century, but in some cases up to 16th centuries. So they believe, like Muslim scientists like Avicenna, Averroes, Ibn Rushd, Jabir bin Hayyan, Al-Farabi, Al-Kandi, Ibn Tufail, Ibn Baja, and so many others, Al-Biruni and Taqiyuddin, they were the real scientists. They argue that Quran talks about religious scholars, and according to the verses of Quran has not mentioned scholars at a number of places, but some people cite one of the verses of the Holy Quran that talks about scholars, saying that these are the people who ponder over sunrise and sunset. They argue that under the light of this verse, the scholars are those who ponder over the mysteries of nature and who talk about matter and the formation of this universe. And they claim that under the light of this verse, in reality, the Muslim scientists who happen to be the centuries that I talked about earlier, they were the real scholars. For instance, it's believed that Averroes or Ibn Rushd wrote more than 1100 research paper or interpretation of metaphysics of Aristotle, and his interpretations were translated into Latin and other languages, and this is how Western intellectual and philosopher benefited from it. Similarly, Ibn Razi is considered very liberal and enlightened thinkers who said enlightened, who came up with enlightened thoughts, which were later taken up by Western thinkers, and they also benefited from it. Some Muslims, philosophers who were expert at medicines, their books were also translated into Latin, and they were taught in Western universities. But since Muslim did not understand the definition of a scholar, some people would argue that's why they are in a way less developed than the Western world, and the wave of development did not hit the Islamic world. For instance, Italy was printing books, and it was banned in the many parts of the Islamic world, and especially the Islamic books. It is widely believed that religious scholars during the Ottoman time banned the printing of Islamic books with printing press, and they were not print for over 100 years. Similarly, in India, the person who tried to translate the Holy Quran into Persian, he was labeled as infidel. the person who tried to translate it into Urdu, he was also declared heretic or infidel, with the mullah or the cleric people saying that Urdu is not a pure language, that's why it cannot be translated into it. And during 16th century, a Muslim scientist in Turkey, his name was Taqi, he came up with the idea of establishing an observatory to observe the galaxies, and he did manage to establish it, but the religious clergy, religious class of that time got it destroyed. During the same century, a Christian scientist had also established an observatory in Denmark, and it is still there, according to Bernard Lewis, who is considered one of the authorities on Islamic history and matters related to Islam and Sharia.